Chapter 1. Elara. Elara Vance knew a trap when she saw one. Not the kind with glittering teeth or steel jaws, but the insidious silken snare of high society, draped in the suffocating perfume of money and old power. Tonight, that trap was disguised as a wedding. The grand ballroom of the Palazzo Visconti shimmered with 1,000 tiny lights, each reflecting off crystal flutes, and the polished smiles of the city's elite. Elara, however, wasn't captivated by the fairy tale facade. She was a ghost in this opulent machine, nursing a champagne flute that tasted suspiciously like resentment, strategically positioned near a potted palm, just out of the main thoroughfare, but with a clear view of every entrance and exit. Her cheap, sensible heels a stark contrast to the designer stilettos clacking across the marble. She was here as a +1 to a +1, a distant cousin of the bride's step-aunt. A perfectly forgettable detail. Just the way she liked it. Her photojournalism career had taught her to observe, to see beyond the surface, to identify the anomalies. And tonight, the anomaly wasn't the bride's suspiciously tight smile or the groom's nervous fidgeting. It was a glint. A pinprick of refracted light, high up in one of the decorative Juliet balconies overlooking the main floor. Too steady, too deliberate to be a stray reflection from a camera flash. It was the kind of glint that whispered of finely tuned optics, of a scope. Her stomach dropped. Not here. Not now. She scanned the room again, her breath catching in her throat. The target wasn't the bride, no, not with this kind of professional precision. It was someone powerful, someone who commanded this kind of attention. Her gaze swept past the grinning politicians, the preening socialites, past the nervous Valerius family members, until it landed. Dante Valerius. He stood by the grand staircase, a solitary monolith of tailored Italian wool and raw, unyielding authority. Even amidst the riot of pastel silks and effervescent laughter, he was a black hole of magnetic intensity. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't even looking at the happy couple. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, were coolly assessing the room, every flicker of movement, every subtle shift in energy. He was exactly what the whispers said. The untouchable, enigmatic head of the Valerius Syndicate. A man who commanded respect through an invisible force field of sheer will. And he was directly in the sniper's line of fire. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Adrenaline, a familiar, unwelcome guest, surged through her veins. She should warn him, she should shout. But a shout would cause panic. And panic in this crowd, with a professional killer watching, was a death sentence for dozens. As if sensing her frantic gaze, Dante's eyes snapped to hers across the crowded room. For a split second, the world outside them seemed to mute. His expression, usually carved from granite, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. Recognition. Warning. And then it was gone, replaced by an intensity that made her palms sweat. She saw him take a subtle, almost imperceptible breath, his jaw tightening. His eyes darted up, not to the balcony but to a different point, a less obvious one. He saw it too. The glint. Before she could process the thought, before she could even decide to move, a large, impossibly strong hand slammed onto the small of her bare back, just above the low cut of her dress. It wasn't gentle. It was possessive. Demanding. Her breath hitched. The heat of his palm seared through the thin fabric, a brand against her skin, sending a jolt straight to her core. He leaned in, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, for her ears alone. "Act like you're with me, tesoro," he growled, the Italian endearment laced with lethal command. "Or we both die." The words were a splash of ice water, yet the point of contact on her back was a scorching fire. She didn't need to ask why. She saw the shift in his eyes, the almost imperceptible tensing of his muscles, the way his gaze flickered from the balcony to a secondary escape route he was already planning. The sniper was aiming, and Dante Valerius, the infamous Mafia boss, had just decided she was his shield, or his distraction, or both. "What?" she began, but his fingers dug in, a silent, painful warning. "No questions," he hissed, his jaw clenching. He spun her slightly, pulling her closer, pressing her back against his front. The scent of his expensive cologne, dark and musky, filled her senses, intoxicating and terrifying. His other hand, equally large and strong, found her hip, anchoring her to him, leaving no room for escape. He angled his body, subtly shielding her, but also using her to obscure his own movements. He began to move, a controlled glide through the milling guests, towards a service exit she hadn't even noticed. Elara, caught between the terror of the sniper and the terrifying proximity of the man currently dictating her life, stumbled to keep pace. "Smile, Elara," he murmured, his breath ghosting over her ear, sending shivers down her spine. "Look like you're furious, but secretly thrilled." Her heart thundered. Furious? Thrilled? This man had just manhandled her, practically kidnapped her, and was now ordering her to emote while a killer zeroed in. The sheer audacity of it, the raw, brutal male confidence, sparked a flicker of something hot and defiant inside her. "Thrilled?" she hissed back, finding her voice a dangerous edge to it. "You just stuck your hand on my ass in front of half the city's elite, Valerius. If anything, I'm contemplating felony assault." A low chuckle, a rich, dark sound, vibrated through his chest against her back. "Better than being dead, tesoro. Now argue with me, loudly, passionately." He tugged her even closer, so close she could feel the hard planes of his chest, the tautness of his stomach. His fingers on her hip moved, not sensuously, but with a possessive friction that made her insides clench. This wasn't about sex. It was about power, control, and a desperate ruse. But the sheer intimacy of it, the enforced closeness with this dangerous, alluring stranger, set every nerve ending alight. "You're unbelievable," she cried, forcing a dramatic inflection into her voice, catching the attention of a passing waiter. She even managed a tearful sniff, digging her nails into his arm, but not hard enough to break the expensive fabric. "How dare you even suggest such a thing?" He leaned down again, his lips brushing the sensitive skin below her ear. "Magnificent," he whispered, a hint of genuine amusement in his tone, a dangerous spark in his eyes when she risked a glance over her shoulder. "Keep it up." "We're almost there." They were a whirlwind of faux lovers' quarrel, a distraction in a sea of polite chatter. Dante moved with an animalistic grace, navigating the human obstacles, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing. Elara, surprisingly, found herself falling into sync with him, her body anticipating his shifts, her voice rising and falling in mock outrage. The danger was real, but the performance was exhilarating, a bizarre dance with death. As they reached the heavy service door, Dante subtly pushed her forward, his hand still clamped to her back, ensuring she moved with him. He shoulder-charged the door open, revealing a dimly lit corridor leading to the kitchens. "I can't believe you!" she practically shrieked, the volume perfectly timed with the thud of the closing door behind them, muffling the ballroom's music. The second the door clicked shut, his hand left her back. The sudden absence of his touch was like a physical shock. He spun her around, gripping her shoulders, his eyes piercing through her. The pretense dropped instantly, replaced by cold, calculating menace. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice devoid of the earlier humor. "And how did you know?" Elara gasped, struggling for air. The adrenaline was still thrumming, making her dizzy. I saw the glint," she stammered, pulling away from his grasp. "Up there, in the balcony, A scope. He stared at her, his gaze dissecting her, searching for the lie. He didn't seem to find one. A scope, he repeated, almost to himself, his lips a thin, cruel line. You have sharp eyes, tesoro. The endearment this time was chilling. And very quick reflexes. Lucky for you, luckier for me. Before she could form a coherent thought, before she could demand answers or an explanation, another door burst open at the end of the corridor. Two hulking men in dark suits emerged, weapons visible beneath their jackets. Dante didn't flinch. "Valerius!" one of them shouted, his voice rough. "We heard a disturbance. What in God's name?" Dante didn't wait for him to finish. He grabbed Elara's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, a stark contrast to his earlier rough handling. This touch was intimate, deliberate, a public declaration. He pulled her with him, not gently but with an irresistible force that left her no choice but to follow. "Get the car!" Dante barked, not to the approaching men, but to a hidden earpiece, his voice laced with an urgent command that brooked no argument. "Now, and alert the others. We have a leak." He tugged her down a narrow, damp hallway, away from the kitchen and towards the service entrance she hadn't noticed earlier. Elara stumbled, her hand still locked in his. His grip was searing, electric, a promise of protection and possession all at once. Her mind reeled. Mafia boss, sniper, fake girlfriend, leak. Her life, usually a meticulous, carefully constructed exercise in blending in, had just been detonated. And the man holding her hand, pulling her into the unknown, was the fuse. He glanced back at her, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers for a fleeting second. A spark, undeniable and dangerous, flared between them, promising a fire she wasn't sure either of them could control.
Chapter 2. Dante. The armored car was less a vehicle and more a fortified vault on wheels. The windows were blacked out, the interior silent, thick carpet muffling the distant sounds of the city. The tension inside, however, was deafening. Dante Valerius sat opposite Elara, having relinquished her hand the second they were inside. He looked utterly composed, as if narrowly escaping a professional assassin at a high-profile wedding was simply a minor inconvenience, a cancelled appointment. Elara, conversely, was vibrating with residual adrenaline and indignation. The champagne flute she'd somehow clung to was now smashed, the stem digging into her palm. She tossed the shards onto the carpet with a decisive, reckless clatter. "Start talking, Valerius," she demanded, her voice tight, the polite veneer stripped away. "That wasn't a lover's spat. That was a tactical operation. You dragged me into a kill zone, used me as cover, and now I'm in a vehicle that looks ready for a siege. I need to know why I'm not already halfway to a police station." Dante leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. His scrutiny was cold, assessing, and far more unnerving than a scream. "You are not going to the police, tesoro," he stated, the nickname now sounding like a threat of ownership. "Because you saw the threat, which means you are now associated with me. If the sniper's superiors suspect you were anything more than a panicked civilian, you become a loose end. A very messy loose end." "And what am I now?" she shot back. "A neatly tied one?" "You are mine for the next week," he corrected, the words landing with the immutable force of law. "And you are currently heading to a secure location where, with any luck, you won't be killed. Consider it a lateral move on your part." She scoffed, the sound laced with genuine fury. "A lateral move from alone at a wedding to hostage of a mafia boss? You flatter yourself." A corner of his mouth twitched, a minuscule, fleeting acknowledgement of her sharp wit. "You survived. My security detail outside the ballroom was compromised. The sniper was a costly, sloppy amateur, but he was backed by professionals, the Moretti Syndicate. They knew I was vulnerable at the wedding. They're trying to destabilize a critical trade deal I'm finalizing this week. Elara's mind, the journalist's mind, was racing. The Morettis. She'd heard the names, the territory, the rivalry. This wasn't just a hit. It was a power play. "And where does I fit into your critical trade deal?" she pressed, folding her arms tightly across her chest. Dante finally shifted, leaning forward. His proximity, even across the short distance, was overwhelming. His eyes, the color of gunmetal, held hers captive. "I have been isolated. Too controlled. Too predictable," he explained, his voice low and deliberate. "I need an immediate, visceral change to my public image. The deal, which involves a massive transfer of assets, is contingent upon my stability, my family's future. The Morettis are exploiting my bachelor status, whispering that I'm too detached, too cold to care about posterity." He paused, letting the weight of his next sentence settle heavily between them. "I need a fiancée. Someone who appears utterly devoted. Someone who, with her unexpected arrival, suggests an emotional depth, a human vulnerability I am supposedly lacking." Elara stared, dumbfounded. "A fiancée? You choose me? A woman you saw for 2 minutes, who was drinking alone by a plant?" "Precisely," Dante confirmed, a glint of predatory intelligence in his eyes. "You appeared independent, out of place, slightly defiant. You are not one of the predictable society dolls I discard weekly. You are unpredictable. You possess a fire that suggests passion and recklessness. And as you proved tonight, you are observant and can follow a command under duress. You will be my temporary shield, my distraction, my perfect, sudden scandal." He pulled a folded legal document from his breast pocket and slid it across the console. "You will maintain the illusion for 7 days. You will be safe, hidden in my private estate. At the end of the week, the deal is signed, and you receive $5 million to start a new, quiet life, anywhere you choose. No questions asked." Elara picked up the document, her hands trembling slightly. $5 million. It was enough to escape the corporate scandal that had forced her into hiding and erase her past forever. But the cost. "And what are the non-negotiable terms, Mr. Valerius? Beyond the obvious pretense of undying love?" she asked, her voice regaining its journalistic objectivity. Dante's lips curled into a faint, utterly chilling smile. "The terms are simple. You live in my space. You move on my schedule. You take every breath under my surveillance. And when we are in public, you will act like you belong to me. You will match my body language, anticipate my needs, and never, ever contradict me. You must sell the performance, Elara, or we will both pay the price." The armored car pulled to a smooth stop. A gate, tall and ominous, slid open silently, revealing the sheer, suffocating luxury of the Valerius estate. A sprawling modern fortress nestled high on a hill overlooking the city lights. The perfect gilded cage. They were ushered inside a vast, minimalist penthouse suite. The space was sleek, monochromatic, and cold, dominated by a floor-to-ceiling view of the entire city. But her attention was immediately drawn to the bedroom. One door, one view, one massive bed. Elara's jaw tightened. "There is one thing you didn't include in your fine print, Valerius," she stated, gesturing sharply toward the opulent, silk-covered mattress. "I don't care how deep your cover story is. I don't sleep with hired props." Dante leaned against the doorframe, his gaze traveling slowly, deliberately, over her. The intensity of his focus made the air crackle. His eyes lingered on her flushed cheeks, the slight rise and fall of her chest, the way she was holding herself, radiating defensive defiance. "Calm yourself, Elara," he murmured, his voice softening just enough to be dangerous. "The performance is public. Behind closed doors, we maintain a professional distance, unless an unexpected visitor requires a spontaneous display." He pushed off the doorframe, taking a slow step toward her. The raw sexual tension in the air was suddenly thick enough to taste, a heady mix of fear, attraction, and pure power dynamics. "However," he continued, stopping barely a foot away, forcing her to tilt her chin up to meet his eyes, "we must be convincing. We need to look like two people whose attraction is so volatile, so consuming, that we simply couldn't wait to be alone. You will spend the next week learning my body language, the way I prefer my coffee, the precise moment I need a distraction, the depth of intimacy our glances convey." He lifted a hand, and for a terrifying second, she thought he would touch her again. Instead, his fingers brushed the air, hovering just centimeters from her collarbone. But the implication of contact was enough to make her breath hitch. "You will share this suite, Elara," he finished, his voice dropping to a seductive rasp. "We will have separate dressing rooms, but we will always be close enough to hear each other breathe. Close enough for the illusion to become instinct. If the Morettis' spy is inside my home, they must believe you are so deeply entangled with me that nothing can pull us apart. Not a wall, not a door." He looked into her eyes, and the sheer audacity of the man, combined with his undeniable, terrifying charisma, ignited a fierce, answering heat inside her. "Understood, Mr. Valerius," she replied, her voice steady despite the rapid-fire beat of her heart. A teasing smirk touched her lips, a spark of pure, reckless humor surfacing. "But just so we're clear, if I catch you even thinking about stealing the blankets, the deal is off. 5 million or not." Dante's cold facade finally fractured, a genuine dark amusement dancing in his eyes. "A challenge, Elara? Good. I enjoy a difficult negotiation." He stepped past her and threw open the doors to a walk-in closet. "Welcome to your new life. Now you have 7 days to convince the entire underworld that you are completely, irrevocably mine."
Chapter 3. Elara. The morning arrived with the harsh, cold precision of a military operation. Elara had barely slept, the sheer size of the opulent suite feeling less like luxury and more like a vast, intimidating holding cell. She found Dante already dressed, impeccably sharp in a charcoal suit, sitting at the edge of the glass dining table, surrounded by documents and a silent, efficient security detail. He didn't offer breakfast. He offered a schedule. "We start now," Dante commanded, sliding a heavy velvet box toward her. "Today is dedicated to the legend of Dante and Elara. We have a high-stakes dinner with the family accountant tonight, and he's a viper. You need to be plausible." Elara lifted the lid of the box. Inside, resting on black satin, was a colossal, cushion-cut diamond ring. It didn't sparkle. It glowed with an inner fire, a dizzying weight of commitment and money. "Plausible," she repeated, staring at the rock. "This is less plausible, more. I liquidated a small European nation for this. It's vulgar." "It's convincing," he corrected, unmoved. "Vulgarity is a language the capos understand. They expect excess. Put it on." She hesitated. This single act felt more binding than signing the contract. It was the visual signature of the lie. But $5 million and her survival hinged on this diamond. With a sigh, she slipped the ring onto her left hand. It fit perfectly, heavy and cold, a brand of false ownership. "Good," Dante said, snapping his briefcase shut. "Now, the logistics of a passionate engagement. We need tells, small, intimate gestures that look instinctive, not rehearsed. I never touch anyone casually. When I touch you, it means something." He stood and walked toward her. The air temperature in the room seemed to drop, then heat up instantly. Elara braced herself, her adrenaline spiking. "Walk with me," he ordered, and they began a slow circuit of the vast living room. First, the distance. Engaged lovers do not walk 2 feet apart. Close the gap. Elara edged closer. "This is fine. We look connected." Dante stopped abruptly, trapping her against the edge of the mahogany desk. He moved with a speed that belied his controlled stillness, his body now angled intimately toward hers. "No," he disagreed, his voice a low vibration that seemed to bypass her ears and go straight to her nervous system. He reached out and placed his hand gently but firmly on the small of her back, the exact same spot he'd gripped during their escape. This time, the touch was measured, a lesson, but the effect was devastating. "This," he murmured, his gaze holding hers with magnetic force, "is connected. It is proprietary. It says, 'She is mine, and I am close enough to protect her if necessary.'" Notice the pressure. Light, but anchoring. Elara's breath feathered out. The heat radiating from him was a silent, insistent pressure. She found herself leaning into the touch, an instinctive response to his sheer physical authority. "What if I need to move away?" she whispered, the proximity making her voice unsteady. "You don't," he stated simply. "Not unless I initiate it. You are the center of my attention, the one indulgence I allow myself. If you are separated from me, you are vulnerable. Rule 1 of our engagement: never leave my shadow." They moved on to the narrative, the story of them. Dante had prepared a complex, detailed history. A scandalous meeting in Rome, a whirlwind courtship, a deep connection based on shared intensity and mutual disdain for convention. "Our first fight," Dante dictated, looking at her with a disconcerting intensity, "was over a Picasso at the Uffizi. I insisted you were wrong about the provenance. You slapped my cheek right here." He tapped the left side of his jaw. Elara couldn't help a skeptical laugh. "Slapped you?" "Valerius, I appreciate the drama, but if I slapped you, I'd be sleeping with the fishes before the paint dried." "True," he conceded, a flicker of appreciation in his eyes for her pragmatism. "But that is the essence of our story. You are the only person who dares to challenge me. The risk excites us both. So, how did I get you back after this fictional slap?" Elara leaned in, playing the game, enjoying the banter, the intellectual sparring. "You didn't apologize. That's too easy. You bought a small forgotten piece of art, something abstract and utterly baffling, and claimed it perfectly represented my complex, maddening soul." Dante stared at her, genuinely surprised. Then a low rumble of laughter escaped him. It was a rare, deep sound that melted a tiny chip of the ice around her heart. "Perfect," he agreed, leaning closer across the table. His expression grew serious, his tone laced with genuine emotion, making the lie feel terrifyingly real. "The emotional depth of our story is this, Elara. We are equally damaged. We crave control, but we are both lost without the other's fire. Look at me like you see my soul, not my ledger." She met his gaze, and for a long moment, the layers of the ruthless boss and the scared journalist peeled away. She did see a profound isolation in those gray eyes, a deep-seated weariness that no amount of power could fix. And she mirrored it, the exhaustion of running, the yearning for a safe anchor. "Like this?" she asked softly, letting a genuine moment of empathy show. Dante inhaled sharply. Yes, he rasped, his eyes darkening. Exactly like that. The kissing lesson. High sexual tension. The atmosphere, already charged, suddenly became thick with suppressed energy. Dante cleared his throat, pushing the moment away. Now the final, most crucial test, he announced, his voice regaining its professional edge, though his eyes remained a deep, turbulent gray. Public displays of affection. They must be undeniable, yet always leave them wanting more. The goal is to sell the story that we are 2 heartbeats away from running to the bedroom. Elara swallowed hard. A hug? A hand squeeze? Insufficient, he dismissed. A kiss. Not a peck, which suggests distance. Not a full conquest, which is tacky. A promise. He stood again and walked around the table until he was standing directly over her. She was seated, forcing her to look up, an immediate power dynamic established. The air hummed. Stand up, he commanded. Elara rose slowly, her eyes locked on his. He was impossibly close. The scent of his cologne, the heat radiating off him, the sheer physical intensity. It was overwhelming. When in doubt, always lead with possession, he murmured, his voice husky. He lifted his hands and gently, carefully, cupped her face. His thumbs rested just beneath her cheekbones. It was the gentlest touch yet, and the most devastating. The objective is to look utterly consumed, he continued, his eyes dropping to her mouth. You are reckless with desire for me. I am obsessively protective of you. He lowered his head slowly, excruciatingly. The tension was a living thing, stretching taut between them. Elara could see the minute flecks of gold in his irises. She felt the subtle shift of the air as his lips hovered a breath away from hers. She was frozen, incapable of retreat, desperate for contact. You look up at me, he coached, his voice now a low, intimate rumble. You give me everything you have in that glance. A challenge, a craving, an ultimatum. He paused, a master of delayed gratification, letting the moment hang, letting the tension build until her skin prickled with a desperate heat. Then his mouth finally connected with hers. It wasn't rough, nor was it tender. It was a precise, professional press. Hard, possessive, and brief. He took control, claiming the space, a master asserting his dominance, but he pulled back before it could deepen, cutting off the potential for a genuine, messy connection. He released her face, his gaze burning into hers, searching for her reaction. Elara was breathless, her knees weak. Her mind was a dizzying blank, the $5 million deal utterly forgotten. Well? He prompted, his thumb lightly tracing the delicate curve of her jaw. Did you feel it, Elara? The promise? She met his gaze, defiance battling the intense longing his touch had ignited. A slow, reckless smile spread across her face. Yes, Mr. Valerius, she breathed, her voice low and challenging. I felt the promise. And you just taught me where your weaknesses are. The look in his eyes was instantly dangerous, a blend of surprise, irritation, and a hot, answering desire. The lesson was over, but the game had just begun.
Chapter 4. Dante. The Valerius estate felt less like a home and more like an embassy preparing for a hostile diplomatic meeting. Tonight's dinner was not a meal, it was an inspection. They were hosting Mr. Vasily Kirov, a notoriously unpredictable Russian financier whose capital was essential to Dante's deal, and the family accountant, a man known only as the Ledger, whose loyalty was as pliable as paper money. Elara was dressed in one of the gowns Dante's staff had swiftly acquired, a fluid sapphire silk that demanded attention, perfectly offset by the blinding, damning weight of the engagement ring. She felt like a beautiful, terrified decoy. Dante entered the drawing room, his presence immediately dominating the space. He wore his power like a second skin. He walked straight to her, his expression a careful mask of possessive adoration. This was the performance. He stopped, his hand going instinctively to the small of her back. The learned, anchoring touch. "Remember the narrative, Elara," he murmured, his breath warming her ear. "The reckless sculptor. The man who taught you to love chaos. Tonight they see only my fatal weakness. You. A fatal weakness that just saved your life 2 days ago," she countered under her breath, a flash of defiance in her eyes. "Don't forget the talent you acquired with the diamond, Valerius. I'm not just here to look pretty." He didn't acknowledge the barb, but the subtle tightening of his grip confirmed he'd heard her. The front door chime sounded, announcing their audience. The ledger arrived first, a thin, spectacled man with eyes that missed nothing. He offered Elara a cool, appraising look. "A beautiful choice, Dante." "Very sudden." "Irresistible, not sudden," Dante corrected smoothly, pulling Elara forward so she was nestled directly against his side, his hand never leaving her back. "When you know, Ledger. Elara forces my hand in everything." He looked down at her, and the practiced tenderness in his eyes was so convincing. Elara almost believed it herself. She played her part flawlessly. She leaned into him, letting her fingers trail possessively up his tuxedo sleeve. He spent an hour arguing with the jeweler over the precise cut of the diamond. She sighed dramatically, looking up at Dante with a mock-annoyed pout. "Told him it didn't match the complex geometry of my soul." Utterly maddening. Ledger's lip curled in a tiny, reluctant smile. Plausibility established. The true test arrived with Vasily Kirov. The Russian was a mountain of a man, accompanied by 2 silent, hulking guards. He didn't offer pleasantries. He offered scrutiny. Kirov's gaze lingered on Elara's ring, then rose to challenge Dante's. "I hear you were involved in a minor disturbance at the Visconti wedding, Valerius." A brief commotion. "Does your sudden engagement introduce instability to our agreement?" The air froze. This was the moment. The high stakes were real. Dante's expression remained cool, but Elara felt the subtle, instantaneous tension ripple through his core. He had to be casual, yet convincing. She didn't wait for Dante to respond. She took a swift, spontaneous action, relying on her gut and the coaching they'd done. She placed her free hand on Dante's cheek, turning his face toward her. Her fingers felt surprisingly soft against his sharply defined jaw. "The disturbance?" she asked Kirov brightly, but with a hint of genuine possessiveness in her voice. "Oh, that was me, Mr. Kirov." Dante dared to suggest that I might prefer a quieter life in his company. I informed him, rather loudly, that I would sooner be shot than be quiet. She leaned in swiftly, claiming his mouth in a quick, fierce kiss, the promised kiss, but with an added reckless passion. She broke contact and turned back to Kirov, her eyes sparkling with defiance and a manufactured giddy affection. "The only instability, sir, is my impatience. He's taking too long to set the date." Kirov watched the exchange, his initial skepticism slowly giving way to a grudging acceptance. The scene wasn't polished. It was volatile, unpredictable, and real. It spoke of a man genuinely obsessed and a woman truly reckless. 2 personalities that would likely produce powerful results. "Ah," Kirov finally grunted, a heavy Russian word. "Then I see. You are a fire, Elara. I hope, Dante, you can keep her contained. Dante finally spoke, his voice deep and smooth, his eyes locked on Elara, holding a dangerous mixture of genuine heat and gratitude. Containment is overrated, Vasily. I prefer the blaze. The dinner proceeded, a tightrope walk of coded conversation about assets, territories, and futures. Elara remained anchored to Dante, her proximity a constant reminder of the new truth. She occasionally offered a quick, seemingly loving touch to his hand, or an arch comment designed to reinforce her image as the wild, unpredictable partner. But her photojournalist's eye was still active, scanning the edges of the room. She was looking for details, small shifts. As Ledger was discussing the logistical transfer of funds, he took a sip of water. His hand trembled slightly, but not from age or nervousness. It was too specific, too rapid. And then, she saw the anomaly. On Ledger's left wrist, hidden mostly beneath the cuff of his expensive shirt, was a tiny, faint, circular red mark. It was healing, almost invisible, but Elara recognized it instantly. It wasn't an allergic reaction. It was a hickey, but positioned precisely where a watch strap should have been. A cheap watch strap. Ledger, the family accountant, was meticulously tailored, wearing a Patek Philippe. His clothing, his accessories, everything screamed wealth and control. But that mark suggested a cheap, hastily acquired piece of clothing, or perhaps a uniform. A uniform that restricted the wrist. Elara's blood ran cold. The sniper, the professionals, the ones backing the amateur, had to be planted inside. Ledger was an accountant, but that mark suggested he had spent time wearing something that bit into his skin. Maybe the cuff of a uniform, or the restrictive material worn by someone lower on the chain. She needed to alert Dante without a word. Dante was mid-sentence, deep in negotiation with Kirov. Elara made her move. She reached across the table and deliberately knocked over a crystal vase of orchids, sending a spray of water and petals across the gleaming wood. Dante. "Oh my God, I am so sorry," she exclaimed, all manufactured panic and clumsy remorse. "It's this ridiculous ring. It's so big I can't feel my hands." The interruption was jarring. Dante's gaze snapped to her. A flicker of pure, unadulterated cold rage at the interruption of a critical point. "It's fine, Kara," he ground out, forcing a strained public patience. He grabbed her hand, ostensibly to check on her, but really to deliver a silent, punishing squeeze. As he checked her hand, Elara moved her thumb, pressing a quick, sharp pattern into his palm. ... Morse code, L. Ledger. Dante paused. His eyes didn't betray a thing, but his grip on her hand momentarily slackened, then tightened again with a new, intelligent pressure. He understood. He took a napkin from the table, not to wipe the water, but to wipe his own mouth, and then deliberately draped the napkin over Elara's hand. He leaned in again, his lips touching her ear, their intimacy a perfect front for the secret communication. "You're making a scene, Elara," he whispered, the tone dangerously low, his breath a warm contrast to the icy warning in his words. "Tell me now, what is it?" "The ledger," she whispered back quickly, leaning into his shoulder as if in distress. "Wrist, hiding something cheap. He's wearing a mask, Dante. He's been inside a uniform recently. He's compromised." Dante didn't react immediately. He gently, possessively, tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered for a second, a silent acknowledgement of the severity of her observation. He straightened up, his public composure absolute. "My apologies, gentlemen," Dante said, picking up the thread of the conversation, as if nothing had happened. It seems my fiancé is reminding me that all negotiations are secondary to my personal affairs. I'll need a moment to confirm her commitment is purely to me. He pulled Elara out of her chair and swept her toward the nearest door, which led to a quiet, private study. The move was abrupt, possessive, and perfectly in line with the narrative of their reckless, volatile passion. The moment the study door clicked shut, Dante slammed her against the solid wood, his hands gripping her shoulders fiercely. There was no pretense now. His eyes were blazing with a combination of raw fear and fierce respect. "Are you certain?" he demanded, the words clipped and sharp. "The left wrist, Dante." "Beneath the cuff," she repeated, breathless from the impact and the danger. "He's been wearing something cheap that cuts into his skin. The ledger is either the leak, or he's the one handling the sniper team." He stared at her, the reality of her information hitting him hard. It was a detail he had missed, focusing on the large-scale threats, while she, the observer, had spotted the tiny pinprick of betrayal. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. The tension was now purely from the high stakes, a dangerous, exhilarating partnership. "You, Elara Vance," he rasped, his eyes burning with an intensity that promised both danger and reward, "are worth more than $5 million. He released her, grabbing his phone to silently text his head of security. The game was now in motion. The trap was sprung. "We go back in," he ordered, his voice cold and commanding, "and you stick to me closer than my shadow. He has no idea we know, and he is not leaving this house alive."
Chapter 5. Elara. The moment they were alone in the penthouse suite, the tension from the evening snapped like a frayed wire. Elara collapsed onto the sleek leather sofa, her sapphire dress feeling like a heavy shroud. Dante was already on the phone, his voice a low, dangerous rumble of command. He spoke in rapid-fire Italian, the only words Elara recognized being the venomous repetition of il contabile, the accountant, and the decisive, final word, silenzio. Silence. The fate of Ledger was sealed, efficiently and ruthlessly, before the main course had even been cleared from the dining table. When he finally hung up, he didn't look victorious. He looked exhausted. The immense burden of his power etched into the deep lines around his eyes. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal tumbler, handed one to her without asking, and dropped into the armchair opposite, running a weary hand through his dark hair. "You saved me," he stated, the admission raw and stripped of arrogance. "Again?" That was more than quick wit, Elara. That was a specific observation, a detail only an intelligence operative or a journalist would spot. Elara took a long sip of the liquor. It burned, warming the fear and adrenaline that had settled into her bones. "I'm a journalist," she confirmed, meeting his gaze steadily, now ready to exchange truths. "Or, I was. A photojournalist. I specialized in documenting things people desperately wanted to keep hidden, like corruption. The reason for hiding." She leaned forward, tracing the edge of her glass. "The wedding? I was hiding. I hadn't seen the bride since college, but she was a loose end I could exploit. I needed an environment where no one would look twice at the quiet, lonely girl in the corner." She took another drink, the alcohol loosening her fear. 2 months ago, I was working on a massive investigative piece exposing a multi-billion-dollar corporate fraud involving tax havens and environmental destruction. I got the evidence, the photos, the ledger, the real ledger. Dante listened silently, his posture still rigid, but his intense focus felt like a lifeline. "They found out," she continued, her voice hardening with residual anger. "They raided my apartment. They destroyed my equipment. They put a price on my head that was small but serious enough to send me underground. I ran out of favors, out of safe houses, out of money. I was waiting for the perfect moment to disappear for good. The $5 million was more than an incentive, Dante. It was my exit strategy. She looked pointedly at the giant diamond on her finger, the symbol of their lie. You don't just pay me off, Valerius. You give me my life back. A heavy silence descended, the sheer vulnerability of her confession, revealing her career, her past threat, and her desperate financial need, was a monumental shift in their dynamic. She had handed him leverage, and she knew it. The cost of the crown. Dante put his glass down, the soft clink loud in the quiet room. His eyes were dark, reflective. I understand hiding, Elara. I just do it with better security. Tell me about it, she challenged gently. About the kind of loneliness that requires a personal army just to manage your affairs. The isolation your power must buy you. He hesitated, a clear wall going up. Then perhaps seeing the shared truth in her eyes, the genuine empathy and curiosity of a journalist, not a social climber. The wall crumbled just a bit. My family is power, not affection, he began, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intimate register. I took over the syndicate when I was 25. Not because I was next in line, but because I was the only one ruthless enough to stop it from collapsing into civil war. I made the hard decisions, the necessary decisions. I cut the rot out, starting with my own blood. He didn't elaborate, but the weight of the confession, the implied betrayal and violence against his own kin, was staggering. Since then, he continued, fixing his gaze on the cityscape below, I have been alone. Completely. Everyone who approaches me wants something. Money, influence, or the satisfaction of seeing me fall. You are the first person in over a decade to look at me and see a target. Not a mark for an affair, but a physical target for assassination. And then choose to help me. He finally looked back at her, his expression a complicated mix of awe and possessiveness. My isolation was my strength. My shield. But tonight it almost killed me. You, the fire, the unpredictability. You were the distraction I needed to find the danger. You are my opposite, and yet we fit. Sizzling chemistry and emotional depth. The air around them thickened again, no longer with artificial tension, but with raw, shared vulnerability. They were two highly intelligent, damaged people, forced together by a death threat, recognizing an unexpected symmetry. Elara stood, moving toward him. She didn't touch him, but she stopped just close enough for him to smell the whiskey and the faint, expensive scent of her perfume. The ledger, she said, her voice soft but firm, changing the subject back to the immediate danger. He was working for the Morettis, but he was here. Inside. That means there's a communications link. A message he was supposed to send once your deal was signed, or once you were dead. We need to find the leak he was reporting to. My security will handle the comms, Dante stated, though he looked impressed by her immediate return to strategy. No, Dante, she countered gently, stepping closer, leaning down so their eyes were almost level. The proximity was a dangerous, deliberate choice. Your security looks for standard espionage. I look for the anomalies, the weirdness, the things that don't fit the picture. She reached out and laid her hand flat against his chest, right over his heart, a gesture that was entirely unscripted, yet felt devastatingly real. His heartbeat, she noted, was steady, powerful, and utterly reliable. A stark contrast to the chaos swirling around them. You need me, Valerius, she whispered, her gaze challenging, not just as a cover. As a partner. I saw the scope glinting in the ballroom, and I saw the hickey mark on your accountant. I am valuable to you, alive and focused. Use me. Dante didn't move. His body was a wall of muscle and control beneath her hand, but his eyes were burning. Her touch was a question, an intimate challenge to his isolation. The tension that coiled between them was no longer pretense. It was the magnetic pull of two equals acknowledging their shared path into the fire. He reached up, his large, warm hand covering hers on his chest, trapping it against the heavy beat of his heart. "You truly are reckless, Kara," he murmured, his voice husky. "To challenge me, here, now. And to offer a kind of intimacy I have spent my life guarding against." He paused, his thumb beginning a slow, deliberate stroke over the back of her hand, sending white-hot sparks up her arm. "Very well, journalist," he conceded, the corner of his lip lifting in a dangerous smile. "You are not just the fire. You are now the eyes of the operation. We find the leak together." He lifted her hand from his chest, brought it to his lips, and pressed a hard, possessive kiss to her knuckles. Not the tender kiss of a lover, but the respectful claim of a commander on his most trusted lieutenant. The shared danger had created an unbreakable bond, far stronger than any fake engagement. "Now," he said, standing abruptly and pulling her up with him. "You need rest. And I need a clear head to process Ledger's contacts. We share the same threat. We share the same space." He led her toward the bedroom, the unspoken question of the one bed hanging heavy in the air, the emotional honesty of their conversation making the physical proximity almost unbearable. Chapter 6. Elara. Midnight in the Valerius penthouse felt less like a time for rest and more like the true start of the workday. The silence of the fortified estate pressed in on them, amplifying the click-clack of keys and the low, intense murmur of Dante's voice. They had commandeered the vast study, turning the antique mahogany desk into their strategic nerve center. Dante's security detail had provided her with the contents of Ledger's office: a stack of hard drives, accounting ledgers, and a pathetic, cheap duffel bag retrieved from the accountant's body. Elara, seated opposite Dante, now officially his consultant on the things that don't fit, felt a thrilling, dangerous surge of purpose. Dante was tracing Ledger's digital footprint, his fingers flying across his triple monitor setup with surgical speed. Elara, however, ignored the screens. She was focused on the physical evidence. The trash Ledger had meticulously kept. "He was compromised by the Morettis, but he was deep inside your organization," Elara muttered, sifting through shredded paper. "He didn't need to be bought. He needed to be leveraged. We're looking for weakness, a sick parent, a gambling debt, a lover." Dante paused, his fingers hovering over a spreadsheet detailing global asset transfers. He looked at her, his eyes dark with grudging admiration. "You think like a predator, Elara, not like a victim." "Predators are less likely to end up alone at weddings," she quipped, her humor sharp and defensive. She pulled a worn, creased photograph from the bottom of the duffel bag. It was a faded picture of Ledger, younger, happier, standing on a beach with a woman whose face had been carefully, deliberately scratched out. But on the reverse, written in faint, elegant script, was a single word: veneer. The intellectual connection, clues and teasing. Elara pushed the photograph across the desk, sliding it past the formidable diamond ring resting next to her laptop. Dante picked it up, his large thumb brushing against the ruined image. "Veneer," he repeated, the name rolling off his tongue in a low Italian whisper. "Venus. A lover. A distraction. A name is useless." "Not entirely," Elara countered, leaning forward, invading the boundary of his focus. "Look at the corner." She was wearing a cheap, mass-produced necklace, a tiny, gold-plated sun charm. "And look at his smile, Dante. It's real. This wasn't a mistress. This was the leverage." Dante leaned in, his focus absolute, his face mere inches from hers. The scent of him, rich espresso and something coolly masculine, flooded her senses. A sun charm. You notice the most absurd details. It's my job, she whispered, the proximity making her voice breathless. Your security is looking for $1,000,000 transactions. I'm looking for the $5 trinket that tells the story. The Morettis didn't pay ledger, they threatened veneer. A woman who is easily identifiable by cheap, distinctive jewelry. A dark, dangerous smile touched Dante's lips. It was the smile of a hunter who has finally found the trail. An excellent theory, Kara, but to find her we need a physical lead, something from the outside. He suddenly reached over, his hand brushing her cheek as he smoothed a stray strand of hair behind her ear. It was a reflex, a casual gesture that nonetheless sent a bolt of pure, unexpected heat through her. What was that for? She asked, her breath catching. The lie, he said simply, his thumb lingering for a moment too long. You looked focused, not adored. Remember Rule 3. Public affection is private instinct. You're distracting me from my work. It's plausible. She narrowed her eyes, accepting the challenge. It was entirely unprofessional and distracting. Good, he returned, his eyes dancing with dark amusement. Then my instincts are working. Now focus on the trash. I'll search for asset trails connected to a $5 sun charm. The escalation, shared space, shared heat. Hours blurred. The work was intense, seamless, and punctuated by the occasional flash of high-voltage banter designed to cut the tension, or perhaps to maintain it. You're a monster, Valerius. Elara sighed, rubbing her neck, exhausted. You haven't moved in 4 hours. Do you not need to eat? Sleep? Blink? I don't, he confirmed, not taking his eyes off the screen. Control is my sustenance. You, on the other hand, are wilting. Stand up. Stretch. Elara stood, moving away from the desk. The penthouse was silent. The only sound was the distant hum of the security systems. She stretched, arching her back, her posture undeniably relaxed after the intense concentration. Dante finally looked up. His gaze, usually cold and analytical, was suddenly hot, possessive and lingering. He wasn't looking at Ledger's file. He was looking at her, the graceful curve of her spine, the way the simple silk nightdress clung to her figure, the vulnerability of her exhaustion. Better, he murmured, his voice low and suddenly husky. But you're too far? Still worried about snipers, boss? She teased, though her heart had started a nervous, heavy beat against her ribs. Always, he confirmed, his eyes darkening as he stood. He walked around the massive desk, eliminating the barrier between them, moving with the quiet, predatory confidence that was his signature. He stopped directly behind her. He didn't touch her, but the air was charged, thick with proximity. His scent, wood smoke, leather, and something uniquely his own, enveloped her. The real enemy is complacency, Elara, he whispered, his voice dangerously close to her ear. A lapse in judgment, a moment where the mask falls off. You're losing your focus. And you're distracting me, she countered, her voice barely a breath. She risked leaning back, letting her head tilt slightly toward his shoulder. A purely reckless, instinctive move. He didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his hands, and she felt the gentle, firm pressure of his thumbs find the knots at the base of her neck. He began to massage, the slow, circular movements of his powerful fingers sending shivers down her spine. It was intended to be helpful, professional. It was anything but. A good boss supports his lieutenant, he murmured, his voice a low, sensual rumble that vibrated through her bones. A good lieutenant doesn't get distracted by the boss's hands, she sighed, closing her eyes, utterly lost in the luxurious pressure. But you are not a lieutenant, he corrected, his voice dropping lower, closer, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "You are my fiancée. And the line between our lie and our needs is getting very thin." He let his hands drop, but not before brushing the pads of his fingers against the delicate skin of her shoulder. A final, electrifying contact. "I found something," Dante announced abruptly, stepping back, putting distance between them, his tone instantly clinical. The mask was back on, but his eyes were still dark, turbulent. The ledger had a private, encrypted account tied to an old-world jeweler in Naples, the kind that customizes charms and tokens, not rings. They received a large, untraceable cash deposit 2 weeks ago. "Naples?" Elara breathed, instantly back in the game, the tension in her muscles replaced by investigative fire. "The sun charm?" He was paying for a customization or an inscription on that charm. The ledger's betrayal was tied to something unique. "Precisely," Dante confirmed, walking back to his monitors, his focus now fully diverted to the threat. The ledger was the labyrinth. But veneer is the key to escaping it. And she is in Naples. He looked at her, his expression resolute. "We move at dawn. We go to Naples, and we find out who the Morettis are leveraging." He had made the decision, and she was already included. There was no argument, only partnership. And the terrifying realization that their game of intense proximity and verbal sparring was about to move from the fortified penthouse to the dangerous public streets of Dante's homeland.
Chapter 7. Dante! Dante watched Elara across the table in the private dining room of their Naples safe house. She was wearing a dress the color of black ink, the silk a dangerous contrast to the blinding light of the diamond on her hand. She looked every inch the wild, desirable woman he was pretending to be obsessed with. He needed that devotion to be believable tonight. They weren't just hosting a rival. They were hosting the Moretti boss, Giancarlo Moretti, and his wife, Clara. The meeting, ostensibly a civilized dinner to discuss territorial respect, was, in reality, a cold war. Every word was a tactical maneuver, and every gesture from Dante and Elara needed to scream undeniable, consuming passion. The goal, convince Giancarlo that Dante was hopelessly compromised by love, making him too volatile and distracted to be a stable threat. The dinner began with frigid formality. Giancarlo, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, watched Dante like a hawk. Clara, the boss's wife, was worse. She watched Elara, her gaze sharp, skeptical, and focused entirely on the diamond. "It is a beautiful thing, the suddenness of passion," Giancarlo commented, raising his glass of Amarone. "Though in our line of business, sudden change is often met with caution." "Caution is for bureaucrats, Giancarlo," Dante replied smoothly, reaching across the table to capture Elara's hand. His grip was firm, possessive, a silent declaration of ownership. He lifted her hand, not to kiss it politely, but to run his thumb deliberately, slowly, over the massive diamond ring. "My fiancée," Dante continued, his voice a low, intimate rumble, directed at Elara but loud enough for the table, "doesn't tolerate caution. She tolerates obsession. We met, we fought, we fell apart, and then we realized we cannot breathe without the chaos the other brings." The test of intimacy. Elara immediately understood the cue. She lifted her chin, her eyes sparkling with a defiant affection that made the performance electrifying. "He tried to keep me hidden, Clara," Elara chimed in, leaning into the lie. "He was so afraid of showing weakness, of being controlled by emotion. It took a public scene at a wedding to remind him that sometimes the only thing worth controlling is the speed at which you run into each other's arms." Clara smiled faintly, but her eyes held doubt. "A compelling story. But passion burns out, Cara. What is left when the fire dies? This was the opening. Dante felt the heat rising in the room, not from the kitchen, but from the high sexual tension that had been building between him and Elara since the moment he first touched her back. This was the moment their boundaries had to shatter. Dante didn't answer with words. He rose slowly from his seat, not taking his eyes off Elara. The air crackled with a silent primal command. Elara's breath hitched, and she rose too, their connection absolute. He stepped around the table, ignoring the presence of the Morettis. He stopped directly in front of her. His entire focus narrowed down to her mouth, her eyes, the racing pulse in her neck. He reached out and curved his hand around the back of her head, his fingers threading into the soft hair at her nape. It was an intensely intimate, possessive gesture. He didn't ask. He took. The broken boundaries. He lowered his head and kissed her. This was not the professional, coached press of their lesson in Chapter 3. This was deep, consuming, and designed to obliterate any doubt in the minds of their audience. His mouth was firm, demanding, moving with a controlled intensity that stripped away the artifice of the act. He tasted of the wine and the controlled desperation that was now his constant companion. Dante pulled her flush against his body, pressing her tight against the front of his tailored suit. His arm wrapped around her waist, anchoring her to him, leaving no space for light, no room for air. This was pure physical declaration. Mine. Volatile. Consuming. Elara responded instantly, matching his intensity. Her hands, which had been resting on his chest, slid up, her fingers finding the lapels of his jacket and clutching them tight. She kissed him back with a fierce, reckless abandon, pouring all the pent-up tension, the shared fear, and the undeniable chemistry of the past week into the exchange. She wasn't just performing for the Morettis. She was performing for Dante, proving her commitment to the dangerous truth of their connection. The kiss was long, too long for polite company. It was a scorching, possessive, boundary-breaking display that screamed of illicit, urgent desire. When Dante finally, reluctantly, broke the kiss, pulling back just enough so their mouths were a breath apart, he kept his body pressed against hers. He looked down at her, his eyes molten gray, his breath coming in a sharp, ragged burst. He didn't look at the Morettis. His focus was only on the beautiful, breathless woman he held captive in his arms. He gently brushed his thumb across her lower lip, his gaze intensely possessive. The gesture was a finishing flourish, an intimate detail that solidified the lie. Fallout and victory. They turned back to the table, Elara's hand linked tightly in his. Her cheeks were flushed, her breathing still unsteady. The performance had cost her. Giancarlo Moretti was leaning back in his chair, a look of profound, calculated annoyance on his face. He exchanged a significant look with his wife, who had picked up her wineglass but hadn't touched it. Remarkable, Dante, Giancarlo conceded, the edge in his voice replaced by a weary resignation. It seems my colleagues were correct. You are distracted. This passion must be very taxing on your focus. My focus is absolute, Dante countered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He tightened his grip on Elara's hand. It is simply redirected. Before, I cared only for assets. Now, I have a far more precious asset to protect. The rest of the dinner was a formality. The message was delivered. Dante was volatile, reckless, and deeply committed to a woman who reflected his own chaos. The stability they sought to undermine was now disguised as obsession. As the Morettis were making their perfunctory exit, Giancarlo stopped at the door. He looked at Dante, and then at Elara. "I wish you well, signora," he said, using the title of wife, a subtle, conceding victory. "You have changed him, and I suspect, for a man like Dante, change can be deadly." Dante merely inclined his head, his hand moving from Elara's to the back of her neck, a final, possessive public touch. The second the door closed behind the rival couple, the air went out of the room. Elara pulled away from Dante, walking quickly to the window, her back to him. The rush of adrenaline was replaced by a hollow ache. "That was too much," she whispered, her voice tight. "That was not acting. That was breaking the rules." Dante walked up behind her, stopping short of touching her, but close enough for her to feel his heat. He didn't deny it. The intense, consuming lie had become dangerously real. He was breathing heavily, his controlled composure finally fraying. "They believe it," Dante rasped, his eyes fixed on the back of her neck, the spot he had just kissed still burning on his lips. "It was necessary." "No," Elara countered, turning to face him, her eyes blazing with confusion and raw hurt. "It was necessary to be convincing. That felt necessary to you. That felt like an answer to a question you didn't ask me." He stared at her, the intense longing of the kiss still vibrating between them, turning the room into a battlefield of unspoken needs. The line between their lie and their desire had completely dissolved.
Chapter 8. Elara. The silence in the opulent Neapolitan safe house was heavier than the weight of the massive diamond on Elara's finger. After the Morettis left, Elara had fled to the terrace, needing air, needing distance from the man who had just used a kiss, their supposed performance, to completely shatter the precise, sterile boundaries they had drawn. Dante followed her, but he stayed behind the sliding glass doors, a dark, statuesque silhouette framed against the city lights. He hadn't touched her since the moment she pulled away in the dining room, but the sheer force of his presence was more suffocating than any physical restraint. Elara turned from the view, finally facing him through the pane of glass. She didn't shout. Her voice was low, trembling with a fury far more dangerous than any outburst. "That was not the contract, Dante," she stated, emphasizing his name with cold clarity. "That was not selling the lie. That was possession. You crossed a line we both agreed to." Dante pushed the glass door open, the sound smooth and heavy. He stepped onto the terrace, the cool night air wrapping around them. He didn't move close, but he didn't have to. The air between them was flammable. "I needed the insurance," he ground out, his jaw tight. They were wavering. The kiss convinced them they were dealing with a man whose logic was compromised by his needs. "They believe I am reckless." "And what do you believe?" she challenged, taking a step toward him, forcing the issue. "What did you need, Valerius?" "Because I felt your focus drop the moment you touched me. That wasn't tactical, that was answering a different kind of need." The accusation hung heavy. Dante stared at her, the usual granite control in his eyes dissolving into a turbulent storm of frustration and intense, undeniable longing. The lie had exposed the truth of his isolation, and her reckless fire was the only thing that seemed capable of thawing it. "I needed you to be convincing," he repeated, though the conviction was shaky. "I needed to know that if I lost control, you would hold the line." "I held nothing," Elara countered, her own voice cracking with the emotional strain. "You made me feel. You made me forget the dinner, forget the Morettis, forget the contract. You made me feel like the fire was real." The argument, meant to provide distance, had done the opposite. It had stripped away their clothing, their rules, their titles, leaving only two people reeling from a week of high-stakes intimacy and forced control. Dante took a step toward her, then another. He closed the space between them with the relentless finality of fate. "Then tell me the fire isn't real, Elara," he challenged, his voice a low, commanding rasp. "Look at me and tell me you didn't want that lie to be the truth." She opened her mouth to deny it, to throw the lie back in his face, but no sound came out. The air was too thick with the scent of his cologne, the heat radiating off his body, the memory of his lips on hers. Instead of speaking, she did the only thing she could. She reached up and grabbed the lapels of his suit jacket, the same gesture she had used during their performance, and pulled him closer, closing the last centimeter of distance. "I didn't break the rules, Valerius," she breathed against his mouth, her eyes dark and challenging. "You did." And then their mouths collided. This time, there was no performance, no audience, no strategy. It was a desperate collision of shared adrenaline, emotional exhaustion, and the sudden, violent release of a week's worth of suppressed desire. He crushed her against him, his hands gripping her waist fiercely, lifting her slightly off her feet. This was the raw, unscripted reality of two people who had danced on the edge of death and found salvation in each other's chaos. It was possessive, demanding, and utterly consuming. They stumbled back into the penthouse, shedding the remains of their composure and their clothing in a reckless trail toward the bedroom. The rest of the world, the Mafia, the sniper, the $5 million contract, ceased to exist. There was only the sound of their ragged breaths, the frantic urgency of touch, and the desperate seeking of a connection that felt terrifyingly honest. The intimacy that followed was less about lust and more about release, a profound, devastating moment where two isolated, terrified souls finally found an anchor. It was fierce, passionate, and focused on proving the realness of the spark they had been forced to fake. Every touch, every kiss, every breathless gasp was a defiant shout against the loneliness that had defined their lives. It was the breaking of the most important rule: don't fall for the lie. The retreat and the conflict. The harsh Neapolitan sun sliced through the bedroom window, brutally illuminating the aftermath. Elara woke first. She was tangled in Dante's arms, her head resting on his shoulder. His scent was imprinted on her skin, and the heavy, comforting weight of his arm was wrapped possessively around her waist. For the first time in months, she felt profoundly safe. Then, the cold reality of the situation crashed down. They had done what they swore they wouldn't. They had let the performance become the truth. She carefully, quietly, slid out of his embrace and grabbed the nearest silk robe, wrapping it tightly around herself, feeling suddenly vulnerable and exposed. Dante woke instantly, his eyes snapping open. There was no confusion, only immediate, controlled awareness. He sat up, his movements fluid and powerful, the sheets falling away from his bare chest. The man, who had been desperately human hours earlier, was already retreating behind the familiar mask of the Mafia boss. His gaze swept over the room, the scattered clothes, the rumpled sheets, then settled on Elara, standing near the window, her back rigid. "Last night," Dante began, his voice gravelly from sleep and instantly clinical, "was necessary. An unforeseen complication. We will not allow it to affect the terms of the agreement." Elara's breath hitched. Necessary? Complication? She turned, her eyes blazing with hurt and cold indignation. He was trying to erase the single most honest, unscripted moment of his life by filing it under business expense. "You are unbelievable," she stated, her voice trembling. "You risked my life. You exposed your entire empire to me. You forced me to lie, and then you broke the one rule that mattered, and now you're going to put it in a bullet point?" He swung his legs out of the bed, the sheer physical intensity of his naked body dominating the room. He didn't move toward her. He kept the distance, establishing the emotional wall he was desperately rebuilding. "I am acknowledging the reality," Dante insisted, his voice hardening. "It was the release of pressure, Elara. The culmination of shared stress. It changes nothing about our agreement." "It changes everything about us," she argued fiercely. "You shared something real with me, Dante. You let your guard down, and you felt something besides control. Don't cheapen it by calling it a pressure release." She walked right up to him, stopping inches away, forcing him to meet her gaze. "If you want me to continue this partnership, you have to look me in the eye and admit what happened. Not as a boss to an asset, but as Dante to Elara." Dante stared down at her, the conflict warring visibly beneath his controlled facade. His eyes were dark and tormented, caught between the terrifying pull of the connection and the lifetime of self-preservation that demanded isolation. He lifted his hand, his fingers twitching, wanting desperately to touch her, to pull her close, to apologize with a kiss. But the fear of vulnerability won. He clenched his fist, letting his hand drop. "Get dressed, Elara," he commanded, his voice cold and final. "We have a meeting with the Neapolitan jeweler this morning. Focus on the mission. The emotional complication is closed." Elara felt the sharp, agonizing twist of rejection. He hadn't just closed the door on their desire. He had slammed it shut on the emotional truth they had discovered. She stepped back, the warmth of the night draining away, replaced by a cold resolve. "Understood, boss," she said, her voice devoid of warmth, her eyes clear and hard. The journalist's mask of objectivity was back on, sharper than ever. "The asset is functional. The mission continues." She turned and walked into the dressing room, leaving him standing alone by the bed, a Mafia boss who had just traded a moment of profound truth for the terrifying safety of his isolation. Chapter 9. Elara. The sting of Dante's morning dismissal was a razor-sharp motivator. The emotional complication is closed. His words echoed in her mind, turning her hurt into a cold, focused resolve. He saw her as an asset, and assets don't waste time pining. They get results. The morning meeting with the Neapolitan jeweler, a small, old-world artisan, had been a dead end for Dante. The jeweler, terrified by Dante's reputation, confirmed that Ledger had commissioned an inscription on a sun charm, but swore he had dealt with Ledger alone. Dante concluded the jeweler was too scared to be useful, and ordered his men to intensify the digital search for Venere back at the safe house. Elara knew better. The jeweler was lying, not out of fear of Dante, but out of fear of betrayal. He hadn't revealed the inscription because that was the direct key to the leverage. Dante and his security detail returned to the primary safe house, leaving Elara behind with a minimal, rotating crew of guards. This was his mistake, treating her like baggage rather than an operational partner. "I need some fresh air," Elara announced to the guard stationed by the terrace doors, adopting a bored, put-out tone. "I'm going to take a walk in the small courtyard garden. 15 minutes. Don't crowd me." The guard, accustomed to the temperaments of spoiled society women, which she was supposed to be, reluctantly agreed, keeping a respectful distance. Elara didn't go to the garden. She slipped into the back utility hallway. She knew Dante's movements. She knew his protocols. She also knew that the Neapolitan safe house, being temporary, had one glaring vulnerability: the local maintenance crew. She found the head housekeeper, a nervous elderly woman named Lucia, stacking linens. Elara didn't try to bribe her. That was Dante's strategy. She tried empathy. "Lucia," Elara said softly, pulling off the massive engagement ring and tucking it into the pocket of her silk blouse. She placed her hand over the housekeeper's trembling ones. "I need your help. This man, Ledger, the one with the quiet eyes, he hurt someone very important to me. I think he hid a message here, in the small back room where we met the jeweler. She didn't mention Dante. She didn't mention the Mafia. She played the woman seeking justice for a personal slight. Lucia's resistance cracked. "The small room," Lucia whispered, her eyes wide with fear. He was so nervous. He made me clean the small table twice. He kept looking at the vents. Vents. A perfect, old-school place to hide a physical item, overlooked by Dante's digital sweep. Elara thanked Lucia, slipping her a small, elegant pin she'd bought earlier. A small act of grace, not a payment. She raced to the small meeting room. Working quickly, she located the vent cover near where the jeweler had been seated. It was screwed on tightly, but she'd borrowed a small, strong knife from the kitchen. Adrenaline coursing, she worked the screws free. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of Ledger's accounting paper, was a small item. Not a paper message, but a tiny, smooth silver memory chip. Elara snatched the chip and replaced the vent cover just as she heard a footstep outside. She slipped the chip into the pocket of her jeans and pulled out her phone, pretending to be distracted. It wasn't one of Dante's men. It was a man she didn't recognize, suit-tailored, but bulkier than Dante's typical security, and his eyes were too casual. A ghost. A plant. "Excuse me, signora," the man said, his accent heavy, his voice too smooth. "Mr. Valerius asked me to check on you. He said you might need a distraction." His eyes flickered to her hand, searching for the diamond. Elara knew instantly. Ledger was neutralized, but the Morettis still had assets inside the periphery, waiting for the signal. And her sudden disappearance from the garden was the anomaly that flagged her. She didn't hesitate. She shoved past him, racing for the nearest staircase. "Tell him I don't need a distraction, I need a new life," she shouted, playing the volatile fiancé to mask her panic. The man didn't follow the act. He broke into a sprint, no longer concerned with appearances. Elara raced up the stairs toward the main suite, knowing she had mere minutes. She locked herself into the master bathroom, slammed the door shut, and slid down the tiled wall, pulling out the memory chip. She needed a way to read it. Her phone had no card slot. Then she saw it. Dante's high-tech, secure communication tablet on the counter, the device he used for encrypted messages. With trembling hands, she forced herself to concentrate. She knew his passcode, his mother's birthday, a detail he had revealed during their fake history coaching, 1115. She typed it in. The tablet unlocked. She inserted the chip. The screen immediately flashed a single file. A high-resolution recent photograph. It wasn't Venere. It was a picture of Giancarlo Moretti's wife, Clara, kissing an unknown man, a low-level capo from a minor, unaffiliated family. But the file name on the chip was the real discovery. Moretti Capo Leverage V.2.mp4. The message was blindingly clear. Ledger wasn't working for the Morettis. He was blackmailing them. Ledger's real leak wasn't about Dante's assets. It was about Clara Moretti's secret lover. The Ledger was preparing to sell this damaging proof to Dante to save himself and his veneer from the Morettis' inevitable purge after the sniper attack. And the Morettis knew. They knew Ledger was coming to Dante with the ultimate leverage, proof that Giancarlo was about to be deeply shamed and his bloodline potentially compromised. The new threat wasn't the deal. It was Clara Moretti. She was the one protecting the secret, and she was the one who had been scrutinizing Elara during dinner. She had to have planted someone to track Ledger's contingency plan. Boom. The bathroom door shuddered violently. The man was kicking it down, and the heavy wood was starting to splinter. Elara acted on pure instinct. She ejected the chip and slid it back into her pocket, then opened a secure encrypted message thread on Dante's tablet. She typed a single, frantic message to his private security channel. "Clara Moretti? She is the threat." Ledger was blackmailing them with a video. He hid the chip in the main study vent. She hit send just as the lock mechanism snapped with a horrifying crack. The door burst open, The plant stood there, his face hard and devoid of expression, pulling out a silenced weapon. Elara scrambled away from the counter, away from the tablet. "You should have stayed in the garden, Signora," the man snarled, advancing on her. "It would have been much quieter." He raised the weapon. Elara braced herself, her short-lived victory turning instantly to terror. She had found the truth, but she was now caught in the crossfire of a deeply personal, deadly Mafia secret.
Chapter 10. Dante. Dante was reviewing Ledger's compromised security logs back at the main Neapolitan safe house when his secure tablet pinged. He glanced at the cryptic alert, ready to dismiss it as a standard security notice. Then he saw the message thread. Elara Vance. His world tilted on its axis. He read the frantic, coded message twice. "Clara Moretti, she is the threat." Ledger was blackmailing them with a video. He hid the chip in the main study vent. Clara Moretti, the wife, the one who watched Elara so closely at dinner. A secondary thought, chilling in its clarity. Elara hadn't just guessed. She had acted independently. She found the truth he and his entire security apparatus had missed. Then, the terrifying realization. She sent this message from the temporary house. She was alone. She was in danger. Dante surged to his feet, knocking his chair backward with a violent crash. The cold control he prided himself on, the self-preserving isolation he'd cherished, vanished, replaced by a raw, white-hot terror he hadn't experienced since he was a boy watching his father fall. This wasn't professional concern. This was the gut-wrenching, absolute horror of losing the one thing he hadn't known he needed until she was gone. Status on the temporary house. Dante barked into his command headset, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "Where is Elara?" The answer came back instantly, clipped and panicked. "Sir, a code red." The third-floor guard just reported a physical altercation in the master suite. Incoming audio suggests they've taken her. Dante didn't wait for a plan. He was already in motion. "Lock down the house. Send the full response team to my coordinates now. I want a live satellite feed of every exit within a 5-block radius. I'm taking the first car." His men scrambled, but they moved too slowly. Dante was a force of nature, a man driven by the primal, fierce instinct to reclaim his mate. He grabbed the nearest weapon, his mind already slicing through potential escape routes, calculating risk and accepting the collateral damage. She is worth more than $5 million. The thought wasn't a financial calculation. It was a realization of her value to him. She was the only one who could see past his defenses, the only one who didn't let him retreat. If they touched her, if they hurt her. The drive to the temporary house was a blur of speed and controlled fury. Dante's security chief, Marco, was relaying information via the headset. The kidnapper was the plant Elara had exposed, a Moretti asset waiting for the signal. He was moving her toward a waiting vehicle in the lower service garage. "Block all tunnel exits, Marco. I want the air thick with my men, but I want the final encounter clean," Dante commanded, his eyes hard and cold. He pulled the armored car into the narrow alley leading to the service entrance, ignoring the protocol of waiting for backup. Dante burst from the vehicle, moving with brutal efficiency. He descended into the dimly lit, cavernous service garage. The smell of oil and stale exhaust hung heavy in the air. He saw them instantly. Elara, her hands bound behind her, struggling fiercely against the heavy grip of her captor. The man had a weapon pressed to her head, dragging her toward a dark van parked near the ramp. "Valerius!" the captor shouted, panic edging his voice. "Stop right there! Send your men away, or the Signora dies right here." Dante stopped, dropping into a low, predatory stance. His weapon was steady, aimed precisely at the center mass of the captor. He didn't waste time on threats. He delivered a psychological takedown. "She told me everything." Dante's voice was cold, lethal, cutting through the chaos. "She found the chip. She knows about Clara and the capo. You are a dead man walking, working for a family that will hang you out to dry to save the boss's shame." The captor flinched. The mention of Clara's secret hit him harder than any bullet. "Clara sent you here to retrieve a video and silence a woman who had the misfortune of finding the truth," Dante continued, pressing the advantage. His eyes locked on Elara, giving her a silent message. "Trust me. But the video is already with me, and my entire network knows the truth. You don't have leverage, you have a liability. You drop her now, and you might get a clean end. You hurt her, and I will ensure your death takes longer than your life." Elara, realizing the tactical victory her message had given him, stopped fighting the restraints. She fixed her gaze on the captor, her eyes wide with manufactured terror, selling the psychological leverage. The man was sweating, his focus wavering. He was a foot soldier caught in a deadly familial war. Dante didn't give him time to recover. He took a single, swift step, firing not at the man, but at the light fixture above his head. The bulb exploded, plunging that section of the garage into shadow. In the split second of distraction, Dante closed the distance, his speed terrifying. He slammed the butt of his weapon into the side of the man's head. The captor went down instantly. Dante didn't even look at the fallen man. He moved straight to Elara, his hands immediately checking her for injury, his touch harsh with urgency and possessiveness. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice thick with unspent terror. "I'm fine," she gasped, the lingering shock fading into adrenaline. "The chip? I sent the message." He didn't wait for her to finish. He reached behind her and savagely ripped the plastic restraints from her wrists. He then pulled her into a fierce, suffocating embrace, burying his face in her hair. It was a purely instinctive, unthinking action, a desperate acknowledgement that the cold isolation of his life was worthless without her reckless warmth. "You left," he growled into her hair, the words raw with pain and anger. "You broke the first rule. You left my shadow." "I found the key," she retorted, equally fierce, refusing to be reduced to a damsel. "You were looking at spreadsheets, Dante?" "I was looking at the air vents. I am your partner, not your possession." The partnership forged in fire. Marco and the response team arrived then, flooding the garage. Dante immediately stepped back, regaining his composure, but his arm remained wrapped tightly around Elara's shoulder, pulling her against his side. A clear, undeniable signal of ownership and protection, no longer an act. "Retrieve the captor," Dante commanded, his voice now granite hard. "Identify his link to Clara Moretti. The video is the real leverage now. The threat is contained, but the war is not over." He led Elara out of the garage and into the light. As they reached the relative safety of the waiting armored car, Dante stopped her. He looked down at her, the mask fully restored, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He was undone. "You risked everything," he stated, his thumb gently tracing the faint red marks the restraints had left on her wrist. "You risked your life for a lead." "I risked everything for the truth," she corrected, meeting his gaze fiercely. "And you risked everything to save me, not the deal." He didn't deny it. He couldn't. He simply nodded, a silent, powerful acknowledgement. The intense, high-stakes moment had forged their partnership into something unbreakable and profoundly real. "Get in the car," he ordered, opening the door for her. "We have the video. Now we end this." Chapter 11. Dante. The hours following Elara's rescue were a blur of cold efficiency. The secured video, Clara Moretti and her lover, was now on Dante's tablet, the definitive leverage. The captured asset was neutralized and transferred to a secure location for interrogation. The war was effectively over. Dante held the winning card. But the victory tasted like ash. They were back in the main penthouse safe house, the luxurious suite feeling oppressive and silent. Elara was sitting curled up on the sofa, still wearing the beautiful black dress from the previous night, now rumpled and smeared with dust from the service garage. She was physically intact, but the trauma of the capture and the restraint marks on her wrists were stark reminders of how close he had come to losing her. Dante stood by the massive window, looking out at the city, but seeing nothing. His control was back, but it was fragile, built on the unsteady ground of profound emotional shock. "The video is being sent to Giancarlo Moretti now," Dante stated, his voice flat, professional. "The deal will be signed, and the Moretti threat will be contained through shame, not violence. The contract is complete, Elara. You saved my empire." He pulled the velvet box containing the $5 million wire transfer guarantee from his inner jacket pocket and placed it on the coffee table. The paper seemed insignificant next to the enormous diamond still resting on her hand. "You are safe now. My jet is ready. You can leave tonight." He expected relief. He expected gratitude. He expected her to run to the freedom she had risked everything for. Instead, Elara rose, her movements slow but deliberate. She walked over and picked up the paper, holding it between her fingers as if weighing its worth against her life. "This," she said, her voice steady, cold with controlled anger, "is what you value the life of a partner at. $5 million and a ticket out." She tossed the guarantee onto the table, letting it slide uselessly across the smooth surface. She didn't look at the paper. She looked at him, her eyes blazing with fierce, hurt clarity. "I am not the same woman who sat alone at that wedding, Dante," she challenged, stepping closer. "I am the woman who saved your life twice. The woman who saw the truth you couldn't see, because you were too focused on the isolation you believe keeps you safe." She pointed to the marks on her wrist, a final, painful declaration. "The fear I felt when that man put a weapon to my head was nothing compared to the terror of realizing you would send me away now, that you would choose the cold comfort of your control over the messiness of what happened between us." She was forcing the issue, peeling back the last layer of his carefully constructed defense. "You called our night together a necessary complication. You tried to erase the moment you let me in," Elara continued, her voice rising with emotion. "And then, when I was taken, you nearly tore your own world apart to get me back. That wasn't an asset retrieval, Dante. That was a desperate man fighting for the only thing he was terrified to admit he needed." Dante remained still, absorbing the blows, unable to move, unable to retreat. He had spent his entire adult life cultivating this impenetrable shield, and she was dismantling it with raw, painful truth. "Say it, Dante," she demanded, tears now welling in her eyes, but her stance remaining strong. "Tell me that when you thought I was gone, you didn't see your future vanish with me. Tell me the act is over." He looked at the black silk dress, the dust, the angry red marks on her skin, and finally, at the fierce, challenging devotion in her eyes. The fear, the trauma, the reality of the past week, it all culminated in one devastating realization. He was utterly and irrevocably lost. He closed the distance between them, reaching out and gently cupping her face with his large hands, his thumb brushing the tear tracks beneath her eyes. The gesture was tender, shattering his own rules of self-control. "The act is over," Dante confessed, his voice a low, ravaged whisper, thick with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel since childhood. "I was terrified, Elara. Not for the deal, not for the syndicate, but for you." He pulled her closer, his voice breaking. "When Marco told me you were gone, my control, it fractured. I saw my isolation, my safe world, and it felt worthless. I saw only the silence you would leave behind, the solitude." He leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes, letting the full weight of his confession settle. "The necessary complication was the most real thing that has happened to me in 10 years. And when I thought they had hurt you, I realized I didn't want the 5 million to be your exit strategy. I want it to be your signing bonus." He pulled back slightly, his intense gaze holding hers, offering her the vulnerability of his broken control. "I don't know how to do this, Elara. I don't know how to be half of a partnership, but I cannot go back to the way it was. I need you to stay. Not as a shield, not as a distraction, but as my partner, my equal. The only woman who sees the man beneath the boss and doesn't run." The admission was a powerful, monumental commitment. For a man like Dante Valerius, "I need you" was a declaration of permanent, binding love. Elara searched his eyes, confirming the truth of his words, the genuine fear, the raw honesty. The pain from the morning's rejection vanished, replaced by a deep, answering certainty. She leaned in, resting her cheek against his chest, hearing the heavy, reliable beat of his heart. "I won't run," she whispered, her arms wrapping around his waist, holding him as tightly as he was holding her. "But you don't get to retreat anymore, Dante. The silence is over. If I stay, you are in this completely. I am the one who asks the questions, and I am the one who gets the truth." He pulled her chin up, sealing the agreement with a kiss. A slow, tender, profoundly real kiss this time, confirming the emotional permanence of their new bond. "The truth is all I have left, Elara," he promised, his thumb wiping away a fresh tear. "We will build a new world. Together." He released her, looking down at the massive diamond on her hand. "The diamond stays. But the terms change. This is no longer a contract. This is a life."
Chapter 12. Elara. 3 weeks after the Neapolitan chaos, the Palazzo Valerius no longer felt like a gilded cage. It felt like home base. Elara sat in the opulent study, not as a guest or a prop, but as Dante's strategic counsel. Her secure laptop was open next to his, and the $5 million wire transfer guarantee, now framed and hung mockingly above the mantel, was a permanent fixture, a trophy of their strange courtship. The formal resolution of the crisis had been swift and devastating. Giancarlo Moretti, unwilling to face the irreparable shame of his wife's infidelity and the public collapse of his family's honor, had quietly conceded the territory and the deal to Dante. Elara's discovery of the Venere video had secured Dante's power without a single drop of blood being spilled by the Valerius Syndicate. She had changed the rules of engagement. The greatest change, however, was Dante himself. The granite boss still commanded loyalty and fear, but the man beneath was irrevocably altered. He no longer sought isolation. He sought her presence. Their work sessions were now shared, intensely focused, and constantly punctuated by the kind of possessive touches that had once been reserved for public performance. Dante walked into the study, fresh from a late-night negotiation, his suit jacket already discarded. He walked straight to Elara, leaning down to press a hard, possessive kiss to her temple, before settling into his chair. The casual intimacy spoke volumes. "The papers are signed, Kara," he announced, his voice carrying the deep satisfaction of final victory. "The last territorial disputes are settled. You gave me the weapon that changed this war from a bloody attrition to a quiet surrender." "It was just observation," Elara murmured, smiling faintly. "You were too focused on the obvious threats." "I saw the human weakness." "Which is why you are no longer a temporary asset," Dante stated, his eyes intense. "We need to finalize the terms of our permanent arrangement." Elara leaned back, crossing her arms, her stance now confidently challenging. "And what does the permanent partner of Dante Valerius do?" "I'm not dusting ancient artifacts, Dante. I want a seat at the table and I want access." "You get both," he conceded instantly, his admiration for her ferocity clear. "Your value is your sight. You see the details I miss. You will be my chief strategist for the undetected. You will run the internal review process, identifying compromised assets, spotting weaknesses in our defenses, and refining my public narrative." He paused, a dark, teasing light entering his eyes. "And you will be my public consort. The fire that keeps the rumors of my volatility alive. The woman who distracts my enemies by proving I am hopelessly, irreversibly committed. Committed enough to stop trying to file me under necessary complication?" she teased, her tone light but pointed. Dante reached across the desk and took her left hand, lifting it to his lips. He pressed a solemn, tender kiss to the back of her wrist, right over the spot where the restraints had left their painful, temporary mark. "Committed enough to know that the silence you fill is more valuable than all the gold in the syndicate vaults," he whispered. "You are my foundation, Elara, and you never leave my side." The true test of their new reality came that evening. They were attending the annual city gala, the same type of oppressive high society event where their story had begun. This time, Elara was not alone by a potted palm. She arrived on Dante's arm, radiating a quiet, absolute power that rivaled his own. The atmosphere crackled as they entered. Whispers followed them, about the diamond, the suddenness of the engagement, the strange, intense connection that seemed to tether the ruthless boss to the fiercely independent journalist. As they navigated the room, Dante's physical presence was a constant shield. He was openly, unapologetically possessive, his hand either on her back or linked firmly with hers. They reached a secluded corner, ironically right near the same grand staircase where he had first claimed her, when Elara noticed the subtle shift. A group of rival associates, remnants of the Moretti network, were watching them with cold, calculated scrutiny, trying to gauge if the passion was still real, or if Dante was already tiring of his new asset. Elara knew they needed a final, undeniable display to solidify the victory. She stopped walking and turned to Dante, her smile slow and mischievous. "You know, Dante," she murmured, her voice just loud enough to carry to the nearby observers. "We've been engaged for over 3 weeks now, and you still haven't bought me a new cocktail dress. I told you that cheap blue silk was scandalous." Dante raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, playing the part of the exasperated, hopelessly devoted fiancé perfectly. "Scandalous, tesoro? I thought you enjoyed the scandal. It suits your fire." "Oh, I do," she confirmed, stepping close enough that her body heat merged with his. "But I prefer scandal on my terms." "I was thinking something red." to match the color of your distraction. Dante's eyes darkened, recognizing the playful, dangerous challenge. He knew this was her signal, the final push, the public reclamation of the power dynamics. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear, his breath a warm promise. "You want red, Elara? You get red. We leave now. I'll have the boutique open and waiting." He didn't wait for her answer. He swept his arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his body with a public, undeniable roughness that sent a shiver through the observing circle. He lowered his head and claimed her mouth in a brief, deep kiss, a final, possessive statement of ownership and profound desire. He broke the kiss, his eyes holding hers with a molten intensity that blurred the lines between the performance and the truth. "The act is over, Elara," he whispered, a smile finally reaching his eyes. "But the passion is permanent." He took her hand, his massive palm engulfing hers. Together they turned and walked away from the staring crowds, leaving the glittering, dangerous city behind them. Elara Vance was no longer the woman who sat alone at the wedding. She was the woman standing beside the Mafia boss, the unchallenged power behind the crown, ready to embrace the dangerous, unpredictable life that was finally, irrevocably theirs.